Hi everyone, my name is Liu Yi. I'm an assistant professor in economics from the School of International Trade and Economics in Jushi. Today, I'm going to talk about Chapter 9, Trade Policies in the Developing and Developed Nations. After learning this chapter, you are expected to learn the important foreign trade policies that have been implemented in the history. In this video, we will talk about the foreign trade policy of the United States from 1930s to 1980s. This part provides an overview of U.S. trade policy since 1934 to 1980s. After learning this video, you are expected to know the evolution of U.S. foreign trade policy. The U.S. foreign trade policy during trade liberalization can be divided into three stages. The first period starts from 1934 until the beginning of the Second World War. This period is characterized as a reduce barriers and expand trade via bilateral agreement. The second period starts after the Second World War till 1967. During this period, the U.S. promoted trade opening with the other member countries through multilateral negotiations and successfully proposed the establishment of GATT through multilateral approach. This is the most important achievement of the U.S. during and after the Second World War. During this period, the U.S. pushed forward successful rounds of negotiation under GATT. Some countries relied on the U.S. market were forced to accept voluntary export restraints. For example, in order to release the protection pressure from the domestic textile sector, marketing arrangements were signed between the U.S. and its exporters, such as multi-fiber agreements for textile and apparel. The third period is from 1967 to 1989. In this period, regional trade agreements were prevalent. The U.S. signed FTA with many countries such as Singapore, Chile, Australia, etc. Other agreements were signed to protect the intellectual property rights, investment, and trading services. To begin with, we will talk about Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930. In order to know what Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act is, we should recall the historical background of the act. First, the recovery of European agriculture sector after the First World War and the excessive productivity of the U.S. decreased the price of agricultural products in the U.S. This legislation was originally intended to protect domestic agricultural interests. Second, in the previous year, the stock market was crashed in 1929. It promoted demands for increased protection from all sectors of the economy in 1930. Now we know what it is for. The purpose of this act is to increase import tax so that to protect American business and farmers, and to help U.S. economy to recover from Great Depression. This act raised the average tariff by 23% compared with 1928's level. Now we want to know its consequence. So what is the consequence of Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act? It did not help the U.S. economy to recover from Great Depression, of course. As a matter of fact, it accelerates the decline of business in the U.S. What is worse is that this act promoted retaliation. Other countries implemented similar tariff barriers against the U.S., such as United Kingdom, Italy, Canada, and Spain. For example, Spain, increased their duties on automobiles, tires, tubes, and motion pictures from the United States. Most tariff rates were specific duties. A specific duty tariff is charged based on the number of articles instead of based on the percentage of the price. In the early 1930s, global price deflation happened. The specific duty further increased the tariff in percentage terms. Mean added valorem duty reached 60% in 1932. This pushed the retaliation from other countries. Trade protection were adopted in many countries to avoid negative impact from abroad. This is so-called beggar sign neighbor. International retaliatory moves led to a dramatic decline in the volume of world trade. As you can see from Figure 1, after the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, U.S. tariff reached as high as 60%. Trade protection did not change until 1934. In 1934, Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act was signed. First, what is the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act? Congress passed the Act of 1934, which allows the President to create foreign tariff reduction agreements without approval of Congress. In 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act. The goal of the RTAA was to promote American export and to expand foreign markets for the producers of the United States. The RTAA granted the President more power. It allowed the President to engage in a more streamlined negotiation process. This act transferred the decision on tariff from the Congress to the President. As a result, the U.S. President were able to conclude bilateral and reciprocal trade agreements. Tariff reduction can be decided by the President's think tank considering all foreign policies. It gave the power to the President to increase and enhance the mutual interests of the U.S. and its partners. What are the consequences of the RTAA? The first one is the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act signaled the beginning of long push to liberalize trade. Agreements had been signed under the RTAA with 21 countries. These countries took a share of approximately 60% of U.S. global trade by June 1940. Signatories increased to 32 by 1945. It greatly reduced the import tariff of the U.S. average added valorem duty had fallen from 60% to 25% by the age of 1946. As we can see from the Figure 2, due to the advocate of trade liberalization after the Second World War, U.S. trade dramatically increased from less than 10% of GDP to nearly 20%. The late 1960s and 1970s presented a series of macroeconomic challenges to the U.S., including the oil shock, the end of fixed exchange rate regime, and high inflation. These challenges disrupted U.S. industries. Import competing industries were struggling during the 1960s and 1970s. They pushed the government to reconsider trade liberalization framework. On the one hand, the main pressures of trade liberalization are from certain vulnerable industries, such as labor-intensive manufacturers. They pushed for legislation against the imports. On the other hand, export-oriented producers opposed the new trade barriers because they were afraid it might lead to reciprocal trade barriers against the U.S. exports. for example, such as the agriculture exporters. A solution for the conflicts of trade liberalization is voluntary export restraint, or VER. I like to say it is a trade policy from exporting countries rather than a policy from the US. We will talk about it in the next slide. For the better understanding of VERs, we will ask three questions. What is it? What does it do? And how was it implemented? First, what is VER? In mid-1950s, certain import competing industries began to lobby for government protection against imported goods. The most vulnerable industries including labor-intensive sector and the sectors that compete with foreign labors, such as intensive manufacturing process, and also sectors with easily adopted technologies. Much of this effort was initially directed against Japan's cotton textile manufacturers. In order to avoid changes of unfair trade practice and to avoid punitive tariffs increased from the US, Japan voluntarily agreed to restrict its export to many of its trade partners, including the United States. These VER were initially applying to certain cotton products in 1955. 1955 was the year of Japan's accession to the GATT, or GATT. This VER is allowed by GATT and WTO because of the opt-out clause of the GATT. It allowed any member to refuse to grant MFN, or most favored nation status, to any country at the time of their accession to WTO. China's situation was similar to Japan in 2001. The last question we should be able to answer after learning this video is, how was it implemented? The VER agreement called for Japan to restrain its textile exports to the US. It allowed a ceiling for the Japanese export. That is, Japan should not export more than 1.5% of US domestic production. An increase of export up to 5.2% was permitted in 1959. Over time, Japan-US VER agreements expand from a few product categories to a diverse set of products such as tuna fish, kitchen utensils, steel, etc. Several other countries, including Australia, France, and the United States, also concluded VERs with Japan. The most important act in the US in 1980 is the 1974 Act. It is well known as the Fast Track. So, what are the impact of the Fast Track? In this section, we'll try to answer three questions. First, what is the 1974 Act? Second, what does this Fast Track do? Third, what are the impact of this Fast Track? First, what is the 1974 Act, or the Fast Track? The 1974 Act provided so-called Fast Track authority. If the President submitted to implement a trade agreement and certain procedural requirements were followed, Congress agreed to allow the President to make the decision instead of legislation. Congress should veto or approve the President's proposal, but not to amend any part of it. Second, what does this Fast Track do? The biggest role of the Fast Track is that it gives much power to the President in making trade decisions. It extended the power of trade negotiation authority to be able to reduce non-tariff measures. It helped to speed up the negotiation by limiting Congress' role. The Congress can no longer set the objectives of trade negotiation or be able to provide active consultation. In addition, legislation authorized the President to be able to retaliate against the foreign imports restraint. via Section 301. Third, what are the impacts of Fast Track? First, it broadened the trade remedy available to the President and the U.S. industry. As a result, it provided adjustment assistance for workers and farmers. It provided relief to the domestic sector, allowed the domestic industry to be remedied from injury caused by import competition. Finally, we will discuss U.S. General System of Preference, or so-called GSP. What is it? General System Preference is a result of Tokyo Round in 1979. GATT enabling clause formalized the idea of special and differential treatment for less developed countries. This GSP was the first preference program designed especially for developing countries. It permitted designated developing countries to export certain goods in duty-free to the United States. Then what is the consequence of a GSP? Most industrial countries, including the United States, introduced individual GSP programs for the benefits of developing countries. GSP are welcomed by the developing countries. It is a kind of non-reciprocal concession for designated developing countries. Finally, let's summarize this video. Firstly, the U.S. trade policy used to be very protective, especially before 1940s. The most restrictive Trade Protection Act is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930. This history tells us trade protection and trade war can never bring prosperity to the U.S. However, Donald Trump can never learn from the history. Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act of 1934 is the historical start of U.S. long trade liberalization process. Trade liberalization process was able to maintain thanks to VARs from the exporting countries, such as Japan. Fast Track provides the President of the United States strong power in negotiating with other countries for trade agreements in favor of U.S. interest. For the developing countries, Generalized System Preference is the first non-reciprocal concession for the developed country. That is the end of this video. Thanks for your listening.